Okay, this is for the current class homework as well as I know Max was missing, so to kind of go over this. This is that alien ship file that we had. So I'm going to go over kind of what we had in class, going over lights and so forth. So I'm going to start out with just lighting our scene. And again, I'm just going to come over here and create a light. So first off, you want to make sure that your render globals are set up to Arnold render, which they are in this case. And you'll notice if we go to Arnold Render and we go to our Environment tab, you can see the AI atmosphere is already plugged in. This just allows for atmospherics. And we're going to actually, in a minute, I'm not going to show you just yet, we're going to right-click and break this connection because I don't want to have these big blooms of light causing all this crazy issues. So these are all the defaults here, and we're not talking about quality settings just yet, just kind of getting an idea. Okay, so the material that's on this mesh, if we go ahead and take a look at it, is a Lambert. Oh, I just realized it's a Lambert. Huh. Okay, so what we're going to do, for now we'll just leave it as Lambert. I'm going to show you guys how we're going to use materials a little bit later for, that's what the next class is all about, for just building up the materials and looking at the material settings for our object here. So we'll keep with the Lambert. It's not really a actual surface that you would want to use for Arnold, but it'll do. Okay, so we're going to go ahead at Arnold. We want to create Arnold lights. We don't want to come over here and create the lights that are here because these lights don't work really well with what we're doing. So there's a lot of lights. I'll go ahead on the lights and click this little dash here, and you can see you got area light, sky dome light, mesh light, photometric light, light portal, physical sky. So we're going to talk about these in next class, but for now I'm going to go ahead and just create an area light. And you got to think about this as the thing with Arnold is there's like an all-in-oneer pretty much on things. So I'm going to go ahead and use my translate tool and move this over. And I'm going to go ahead and leave the light the same size that it is. If I hit F to frame it, you can see I want to face it towards the actual guy right here. And I'm going to go ahead and look from above and move this over here, and I will rotate it 45 degrees and then have it down 45 degrees and maybe bring it up a little bit. Okay, so you could always look through these actual lights. So if you go to view, you can say, let's see here, look through selection. So under panels, look through selection. Now I'm looking through the light. So this is a nice way of kind to set up your lights as best as you can here and have it face towards your object. So you become the light. So I'm going to go back to the actual camera here, the perspective camera, and we have our light set up. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the render. You're going to be tempted to use these three buttons, or these two buttons, IPR, which is the kind of interactive mode, and the render frame, but I want you to not do that. I want you to go to Arnold render view. If you want to make a hotkey for that, you can hold down Shift and Control and click it, and that'll make a little hotkey right here on whatever menu or shelf you have. So I can go ahead and click on this. Here we are, and I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and gives us this live interaction. Now you can see that the light itself, there's nothing going on in the scene, so what we need to do is amp up this light. So I'm going to really crank up the exposure here. I like to just hit 20. And then I start dialing this back. So I'm going to start dialing it back, and there you go. This is our key light. Key light is going to be extremely, it's going to be the brightest light. And we want to get this 2-to-1 ratio going. We're going to have one side twice as bright as the other side. As you can see, we have shadows in these areas here, and they just are absolutely a nightmare because they... I want to see the details on this side of the model. I don't want, again, to make it look like a vampire. I want to actually see the shadows. Now, there is some light actually bouncing coming down here and lighting the bottom of our actual ship here. This is quadratic light. Quadratic light has every single unit away. It is a quarter. It's basically taking the previous power of that light, and a quarter of that is basically 1 unit away. A quarter of that light is 1 unit away. So there's a quadratic fall off. It's very fast. You can see it's very bright here, and then the light goes off. It's not a linear fall off. It's a logarithmic quadratic fall off. Now, if the light is very small, which you can see it's very small right here, you'll see that the shadows are very sharp. Okay, if I take the light and grow it, the shadows are very blurry. So if it was an overcast day where the sun hits the cloud becomes a big light, you would get kind of blurry shadows. If it's a broad, blasting blue daylight day out, and the sun being a very small light in the horizon, you're going to get sharp shadows. So the smaller light, the sharper the shadows. The bigger the light, the blurrier the shadows. And this is all relative to everything in distance and size. Like as we know, the sun is bigger than, it's a very big light, but from perspective of where we're at on the Earth, it looks very small in the distance. It's not very small. It's about the size of our thumb if we kind of put our thumb up in the air and look at the sun during the daytime. So you usually get sharp shadows, and of course you get a blue shadow area because of the actual, the Earth itself is blue in a broad daylight shot. What's really great about these atmospherics, and this is a beauty of Arnold. Arnold is probably one of the best volumetric rendering systems with unbelievable speed, and you get these awesome volumetric rays here, which are really cool, and you can actually add a bit of noise and variation in this, because this is very, very pure, perfect mist, right? When you have fog has different densities and so forth. So when you see this, you kind of like your brain is, again, we talk about patterns. We talk about the fact that you look at it and go, this is too perfect. And again, we got to make that imperfection. So as you can see, this is really cool. What's happening is you're getting direct light. Direct light is where the light hits this. And you're getting indirect light, where the light actually bounces off the ground and lights the underpass here. So that's why you're not really seeing a lot of light filling in over here, as you can see. A lot of that has to do with the samples, the bound samples. So if I go to my render globals, we can go over to Arnold render here and see here. So we have, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, yes, if I come over here, you could see the diffuse bounce is 1. So if I decrease that, there's not a lot of bounce happening. As I increase this, you'll start to see these shadow areas start to fill in. So watch as I take this down to 0, the light's bouncing and stopping. Now, just by putting this to 1, the light's coming, bouncing, and going up. If I put this to 2, oops, the 3, sorry, the diffuse light, the light's bouncing, bouncing, bouncing. So it's getting over there. So by default, you could just leave it at 2. Things start to fall off at that respect. So the key light, not all the time, is usually a very small light. It can be at 2 soft lights, the key and the fill, but they're usually on opposite ends of the whole spectrum. So you can actually take the color of this and change it. You can actually click on color and choose a color. So I can choose green, yellow, red, if you want, the light. But I don't want to do that. I want to actually override my color by clicking on use color temperature. And I want to use a color temperature that is between, if I take it down to this is going into tungsten-like, like a light bulb. And then it goes into what would be candlelight as you get further down. So then you're going to this white value, which is like, can be fluorescence, and then 5600's daylight. So if you're outside, it has a kind of slightly bluish tinge. And then finally you get to even crazier light. So if you've seen like sulfur burn or that very bright light that's on your stovetop, that's the color temperature, and that's why you get a blue light on your stovetop when you light up your stove. So you can see pretty much it. And if you want to, you can go online and look at the color temperature variations of these, and you'll know if you're trying to mimic a specific light. So here I did a little Google search, and you can kind of see the variation here. You can candlelight as 1000 to 2000, tungsten lamp light bulbs 25 to 360, sunrise, sunset. These are commonly the color of when you set up your color temperature for your white balance. This is generally, you see auto white balance will try to get in this zone. Fluorescent lights, if you're on the outside, you're talking 4000. So if you were filming, say, in one of our classrooms with the fluorescent lights, you would actually set your color balance or white balance to something like 4000. And then you see like daylight. It gets even crazier here with flash and cloudy, and then here's a shady day, so shade or cloudy. So there's a lot of interesting little variations here that you can kind of fiddle with, and it's going to mimic the reality as best as possible. So I'm going to leave this. I want this really blue just for the sake of color contrast. So I'll take the actual temperature and start to dial up. So again, if you want very exotic colors, you can click it up here and turn off use color temperature. But now I just want to have a nice blue there. And I want to have this give us enough punch. And what I mean by punch is I want to have just a little bit of this area here blown out, but everything else you can see a gradient. And so I'm going to go ahead and just start to bring this up. I want you to be aware the image you're looking at is, to a certain degree, it should be set for color management to sRGB. We're going to be talking, I didn't talk about this in class, but sRGB is a specific logarithmic nonlinear fall off of a linear image, rendered image. We're going to talk about this in next class about understanding color management, because color management is pivotal when it comes to rendering. You know, sometimes people will render things and look at them and go, oh, they look very contrasty. That's because they're rendering them linearly, and so many people's reels have linear renders that look terrible. So, you know, I think we might as well go into a little bit of color management here. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to explain what this is all about, but if you go into your preferences, Windows setting preferences here, I'll go ahead and close this, by the way. Go to Windows setting preferences, preferences. I do a whole video on understanding color management. So if you go to color management, if we take a look, it's set up to the default here. And let's see here. Yeah, so it says enable color management. It's on. It's on. So we are looking at it through sRGB. So again, I'll go back to Arnold. I'll render view. And I'll hit play. Now, you can see this little button over here that says, let's see if I can take a look at it here. And I think this is only in this view. Why don't they have this? This is kind of dumb. There should be an option here to turn off color management. I don't see it on here. No, it isn't here. Huh. Okay, so I know I told you about about not using this IPR here. It's this IPR interactive, I forgot what it represents, interactive, whatever, rendering. It's different than Arnold Render View. You'll find your computer's going to start chugging when you use this one. I don't know why. Yeah, you might find your computer just you'll start to hear your engine rev up on your computer. I don't know why, but if you click this one, and you can already see this is like revving up, my computer goes nuts. I have a insanely crazy fast computer, and this thing is just taking 20 years just to load up the IPR. And I don't know where it's at actually. Where the heck is the IPR at? That's weird. It's kind of giving me... What's the matter here? Uh-oh. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. It's like either it's hidden, there should be an IPR window in here. Whatever. Let me hit pause here. Oh, there it is. Oh. Oh, I know what it is. Oh my gosh. Whatever. I'll just go to Arnold Render View again. So we'll talk about our sRGB and turning that off, but I want you to be aware that this is a nonlinear sRGB setup. And what that means is the fall off of the highlights to the shadows is it's got a gamma 2.2 in the midtones. Now again, you're probably going to go, what's that all about? But don't worry. We'll talk about that and why that's important, because that's the way our eyes register things. Back when they invented computers, they noticed that the images rendered out were very contrasty, and they said, well, crap, the human eye doesn't look like this, or doesn't register images like this to mimic to what's in reality. So they added a sRGB gamma 2.2, which is basically taking the midtones and raising them up, and that's what you're seeing here. If you were to look at this thing linearly, it would look very either white or black, very contrasty, and not very appeasing to the eye. So just be aware of that. Now, anytime if you guys have a slow system, you might want to hit stop here. My computer is pretty fast, so you can see I can interactively move around pretty quickly in here, and I don't get any kind of chugging here. Okay, so let me go ahead and close that. I'm going to go ahead and turn on View Camera Settings Resolution Gate, and we are working at 960 by 540. If you go to your render globals, you want to make sure you're at HD 540, which is 960 by 540, which is a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, which is what you would usually deliver for your reel. So whether you're doing animation or compositing or whatever, you want to present this in the medium that you would get to an employer, which would be via online or via HD TV they'd play at the studio to critique your work, which would be a la 1080p or 16 by 9 aspect ratio, whether that's 4K or 2K, not 2K, but 4K 16 by 9, 1920 by 1080 or 1080p 16 by 9, or 1280 by 720p 16 by 9. So that's an aspect ratio across, which is 1.778 to 1. So anyway, that blah 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 information, let's go ahead and duplicate our light. Pretty simple. So you can go ahead and, if you want to, you can call this your key light, so you don't get confused. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate, Control D, that light, and I'll drag it over here. I'm going to look over from above here. And again, you could look through the light if you wish, if you kind of get confused. And I can put it over there. So I'm going to go to IPR. Oops. I'll go to Arnold render view. Careful there. Careful there. Make this pretty small because we got a very little real estate here to play around. So now we got this side here. Now, if you remember in class, I mean, for those of you that missed class, we did a ton of looking at lighting and so forth and examples. But the fill light is, the whole purpose of fill light is to fill in the shadows over here. We don't want to have Nosferatu, so if you can see if I turn the exposure all the way down, it's just pure black. We want to actually fill in the shadows, but we want to have a 2-to-1 ratio. This side should be twice as bright as this side. So there's common things called high key lighting, low contrast, which would be like this, where there's not a very heavy aspect, not a real difference, but there is a little bit of a difference. That's soap operas and comedies you see in movies. If you're talking about dramas and so forth, you're talking about 2-to-1. What's called low key lighting or high contrast. And you get sort of like that dramatic, you know, we're talking about Born Identity and all that. You kind of stark contrast from one side to the other. This is not very appeasing. I'm sorry, this is very appeasing. What's not appeasing is frontal lighting, which is stuff like this. It's like, you know, looking at something and you're like, get this light that's like, you know, blasting straight on. It's canceling out all the shadows, and it's not looking the greatest. Now you can see if we take a look, we're probably getting a double shadow here. There's one there, and there's one there. So what I like to do, although it's not actually the rule book in this, but I like to take this fill light and make it big. And by making it big, I am I'm canceling out that second shadow, but having a soft light be the fill. So you can see now there is still a shadow, obviously, but it's a little bit softer. And you don't want to have a bunch of dual shadows or a million shadows everywhere. You want to have a nice, appeasing image here. Now, I want to also talk about, you guys have seen this in class, but the normalization option. The normalization here is on every light. If I turn it off, it gets blown out, and it really has to do with the size of the light. Okay, a stadium light obviously is bigger than a light bulb. So the bigger the light, the brighter it is. And if that's the case, I have to counteract it with the exposure going down. With normalize on, which is a nice option, it's not realistic to the way the real world works. Because the bigger the light, the brighter the light. But as I scale the light in and out, you can start to see how the actual intensity of the light stays the same, but the softness of the light changes, obviously. So this can be good. You know, it's not illegal or nothing, but you're cheating a little bit because you're using some sort of computerized reality that's not photorealistic or doesn't respond physically accurate to the real world. So this is looking really, really nice. At this stage, I want to cancel out this fog, which is really cool, but I don't want to have these big blooms of light up here. What I don't like about this atmospheric stuff is, even if I come in here and try to cancel out this light, I believe you can just, by default, the lights should be hidden, but it kind of leaves a bloom. There's nothing you can do about it, because the reality is the light itself can actually, like if you click here, cast volumetric shadows, you can see the shadows it's casting, the volumetric shadows. Okay, so this is my regular light, or my key light. This one I should probably rename to fill light. Okay, so my key light, my brightest light, the one that's going to track the eye to a certain area of the face, or in this case, a robot. You can take the reality here of cast shadows. You can turn those shadows off and on. You can see the shadows popping off and on. And then you can take the shadow density and bring it down, so almost like an opacity meter. But the big thing here I was talking about earlier is when you get into these volumetric goods, it's got cast volumetric shadows. So you can turn those on and off. You can see those nice God rays, as they're commonly called. Really cool stuff, but I'm not a fan of this stuff because light, when it hits atmospheric particles, it's going to bloom out. So this looks great if I could frame out this bulb of light that's in the shot, right? Or move the lights further away or something. That looks pretty cool. But the only beef I have with this is it's kind of hard to frame the shot with this stupid thing in the way. Either I have to maybe composite it out, which is something we might do, or in this case, let's just get rid of all the volumetric rendering. The way to do that is to come over here to your render globals, and we're going to go back to Arnold render view. Click under this tab environment, and you're going to right click on atmosphere and say break connection. So now you have a very not so exciting dull look, almost like a void of atmosphere, like we're in outer space, right? There is no atmospherics, not like the real world. I'm going to save before this crashes again. Save, guys, and save iterations, because things can get crazy in here. So now we don't have that bloom of light. Get a little bit more control here and take a look at things. So I'm going to take this light here and continue to mess around. We'll go to my temperature. Let's make this warm, okay? And again, that's the beauty of it. If you take a look at the color wheel here, you know, a very kind of warm color here, orangey color, works as far as color contrast, and it's very appeasing to something that is very cyanish, which is commonly a color temperature of a high value. So having these contrasts between green and magenta, orange and blue, use also red and blue is big, although they're not perfectly complementary. These are all additive based. So I can go in here and go pretty deep, maybe even to red, but I think I'm going to stick with orange. And then I'll start playing with my exposure a little bit. Let's see if I can get something that is not too crazy. I want to have that nice warm versus cool value, but I want it to be very subtle. I don't want this to be kind of a black and white image. It's kind of boring. Okay, with that said, let's talk about separating the object to the background. Now, it's already got a pretty decent separation, as you can see, but I want to backlight this object, and the whole purpose of backlighting it, and again, if I look at it from a top view here, is we either want to have a light that's giving this a rim light or an edge light, which separates it from this black void background, or we want to put a light on the background itself. So think of a light facing this direction, or a light facing this direction. Okay, and in doing so, you're pulling, you're stripping or cutting out the actual object so it doesn't slip away into the background. Like even like this area right here. This area right here is very dark, and it's literally melting into the background. I want to separate this thing from the background, and we're gonna put a background back there so that it actually we have a nice appeasing presentation. This is all about presentation. I usually talk about the movie Schindler's List, a very famous film that won a bazillion Academy Awards. And in the movie, there's the Jewish accountant, and he's sort of slave labor, and he looks at Oskar Schindler, who's a sort of a German entrepreneur opportunist who's getting free slave labor from these Jewish prisoners, and he basically says, the accountant, who's like, I'm doing all the work here, we're doing this, and that, what are you doing, Mr. Oskar Schindler? And he goes, I'm not supposed to work, I'm all about presentation. And he says that's how he gets the money to pay for the munitions factories, all by presenting these wonderful baskets full of candies and chocolates and drinks and so forth, and fine wines that he finds from very hard areas to find, and he presents these to just German people that are interested in investing in his company, and he's basically wooing them and wowing them into with fine letters that describe, you know, how the fine quality munitions or pots and pans that he could create. And that is what makes them, and he goes to parties and he just presents himself and becomes friends with these guys in a very strategic way of networking. And in the midst of all that, he's presented as this, you know, it's the presentation that is what's getting the money to fund the whole operation. So that's what that's basically what he does. And for you and getting a job and getting that opportunity is to have a wonderful presentation, even with the most banal type of things. And I take something very simple, something in this case which is not textured, and try to make something of it that you would look at if you just rendered by default, it would look like absolute crap. So we're going to take absolute crap and make it look awesome. This is not absolute crap, but it's just basically something that's very simplistic. Commonly, you would never want to show this to an employer. You would never want to show somebody like, check it out, I got this untextured object. And they'd be like, what a lazy bum. They didn't texture this thing. But the whole purpose of this is just to show off lighting and kind of get into lighting. So let's make that backlight and stop rambling. So I'm going to go ahead and take this... actually, let's take the key light, and I'll duplicate it. Bring it over here. I think I'll look through it. So I'll go to Panel, look through Selection, move my way around, and then I could just go ahead and point this puppy towards this guy. There we go. I probably want to get a little closer too. Let's get really close. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to get out of this Panel, Perspective, and now we have the light facing where we want it to. All right, so let's see how this light is reacting. So the color of the lights, I could probably go back to something a little bit warm. So let's go to color temperature. Let's try something else. Let's get some red so we just see it. You can see there's a contrast there, which we can kind of take a look at. You see it's backlighting the object, and it's actually separating it out of the background. Now, some people, their backlight is obviously backlit, but in this case, you might also want to get up a little bit higher and sort of light the edge of the object here. So let's see. I'm going to take a look here. I don't want to. I'm going to try to go 45 degrees off into the corner here, just so I have it. It's giving an additional feel to the scene here, and it's going to be a little hard to kind of pull this off. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to take the color temperature. I'm going to make it a neutral white color, and then I'm going to take the exposure and really start to ramp this up. Let's see if I can kind of pull this back. You can see that rim light. See it? Okay, so now I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and separate these lights off into layers. So I'm going to click on this little button here. There's already some layers in here. I don't know what they're doing. I guess, oh, I see. I had some layers for this. I want you to go ahead and take layers. Say create empty layer, layer, create empty layer, layer, create empty layer. Go ahead and label these. So I'm going to call this key. I'll go ahead and double click this one. Call this fill. And I'm going to go ahead and double click this one, call it backlight. You can call it rim light too. Rim light tells me that it's actually lighting this actor, because the backlight can also light the background, which we need to put a background back there first. So I'm going to take the key light, put it under key, and say add selection. So with it selected, now I can actually take the visibility off and on. Now I'll go to fill, grab that, click on fill, right click, say add selection. Turn that off. So now we're seeing the backlight by itself. I'll take this light, call it backlight. And take the backlight, right click, say add selection, and now we have that light. So you can see these individually. So here's the fill light. Here's the key light. Here is the backlight. So this allows me to really get some control here. So I go to my backlight options. And you can see my color temperature here, so I'm going to kind of fiddle with this, get it kind of in a white value here. And I could take this and try to do what I can to backlight Try to see if I get really close. It's really cool if you get really close. I'm not worried about the ground yet. Let me go ahead and save this. This can crash, by the way. I'm warning you, it can crash big time. So I want to get really close up to that sucker so I get that nice burn. The closer the light gets, the more you get that nice burn. And I'm just going to move it over here. See that nice edge light there? Okay, so I'm going to kind of rotate this around. By the way, you can also, because it's also creating a square layout. If we take a look at the ground, it's kind of a square layout. So what you can do is you can take this and put this from quad to disc, and it makes a circular shape, which is really cool because that's really like how Hollywood lights are. They're circular in appearance. You're going to start to see little noises here, and that's the bounce light coming up, and then the samples are low, so you'll get this fireflies, little dots, and that means you just got to increase your samples. So I'm going to go ahead and play with that. I think if you take a look at the visibility here, we have diffuse spec. This is the individual lights bounces. So if I take this to a value that's lower, you can see we don't get a lot of fill light. We don't have light bouncing on the ground and then filling in the darkness. So you have ultimate control here on individual lights bouncing. Okay, in this case, I want to bring the diffuse bounce down pretty heavy, and then I'm going to start to ramp up the temperature or the exposure. You can see I'm getting that nice edge light there. See that? Okay, let's start to reintroduce our other lights. So here's my fill, and here's my key. So you see the rim light there, right? You see pretty much everything else as is. And let's go ahead and just kind of take a look at this. So this is looking really nice. We've got a nice separation here. Now the shadows on the ground are a mess, obviously, because we got this is like studio lighting here. It's not too bad, actually. That's where compositing would come in. I would actually try to see if I can kind of render this separate and get the background out of there. You can see little speckles. It takes a little longer to render. It's actually holding up pretty well. Okay, so in regards to the background, what I would like to do is create a polygon plane. And we're going to go ahead and scale that up. And we're going to go ahead and rotate that 9 degrees. Ooh. I'll go 90. And let's go ahead and put that back here. Now, some people will do this, okay, which is okay. But then what you probably might want to create is a cyclorama. In this circumstance, we're not going to do that. That's where you'd actually have a curved transition all the way to the top. But I'm not worried about that. So I'm going to take this and just scale this up to some ridiculous size. Look at that. There we go. So now we have a nice presentation. You see everything's starting to feel very pretty. Okay. Now, in the midst of this here, this is where you can start to get kind of picky about all this light pollution, all this garbage. In filmmaking, people have barn doors, little kind of flaps that are in, so they kind of block off and create shadow and light and shadow and so forth. So how do we kind of make this more appeasing and so forth? Well, one of the things, if you take a look at this ground here, it's called a ground plane. So let me go ahead and save this because my computer will probably crash. I'm waiting for it to crash. So maybe I don't want this light affecting the ground. So that's where light linking comes in. So I'm going to go to Windows, I'm going to Relationship Editor, and I'm going to go to Light Linking, and I'm going to choose Object Centric. Object Centric is basically, if I take the ground plane, it shows me the lights that are being affected by what, it shows the object, shows the lights that are being affected by it. So I want this light, this backlight, to light this, but I don't want it to light the ground. So what do you do about that? Well, I can actually say ground plane, act as if the backlight is not affecting it. So now I don't get that nasty hot spot on the ground. See that? But I still get this highlight. So this is ultimate control. You can't do this in the real life, unfortunately, and that's why they use flags and scrims and barn doors to kind of block the light back and forth. But you can see this is more prettier than something like this. See that? It's like, ugh, look at all that just slop. That's a lot of spill light, as they commonly call it in Hollywood. So it's like a lot of spill garbage and so forth. So that's looking pretty good. Now, also you have this background image piece here we created, which I can call the backdrop. Okay, I labeled it. And maybe I want the backdrop to not be affected at all by nothing. So I can say backdrop, no, 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 and there. So this light is no longer, it's not being affected. However, the light that is coming in is bouncing and hitting the back wall here. So keep that in mind as we kind of work through this. Is there a way to stop that? I believe if you go on the geometry level, let's see if we can kind of play with that. So here's the geometry level in the attribute editor. I believe you can come in here. Let's see here. Go to Arnold tab. Yeah, you might not be able to control that, fortunately. I thought there was a way to control it, but whatever. All right, so we got this back here, and now I have that. Now I want to light the background. So we're going to create, save my scene. Go ahead and close this. I'm going to go ahead and create a light. And it's going to be just another one of those wonderful, let's go here to lights, Arnold lights. Now we're going to get into these other lights here. What the heck are all these lights about? I'm going to go ahead and choose another area light. All right, so let's take a look. Go ahead and scale that up. And I'll go ahead and kind of come around the corner. I'm facing this direction here. And I'm going to try to light that wall. So what I'm going to do is come over here. And currently this light is lighting the background. I'm going to set this to disk. And then let's start amping that exposure up. So we'll start to 20. There we go. All right, so let's see how it's looking. Peter's starting to chug, by the way. Hopefully it doesn't crash. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I can feel a crash. And I think we crashed, gang, so I'm going to go ahead and pull out. Okay, so here we are back, and I've basically made the light again here. And I've set the light shape to disk, and I've got the actual exposure set to about 16, which is pretty high. So at this point, we probably want to set a camera angle. So I want to bring up a little bit of understanding of how to light backdrop images, and I'm using my friend Caleb here. Caleb is insanely popular. He used to be my cinematographer for a lot of my projects. We were just kind of friends in Chicago. He became, I think he's like one of the top, if not number one, YouTuber for filmmaker behind the scenes stuff now. His website is a DSLR shooter, and he's got a bazillion, I think he's got over a million subscribers or something. So he's big shot. And his lighting setup is really cool. It's just him there. This is the studio light presentation, and what he has is looks like a slightly magenta backdrop, and then he's got this nice blue highlight here, as you can see, and it kind of separates him from the background. So instead of having, so he's got a key light and he's got a fill light, but he doesn't have an edge light here. So the alternative to a rim light or an edge light is a light that just lights the background. That separates him from the background. So we're going to go ahead and try that out. It's probably good to get your frame set up. So I'll kind of get this kind of set up here, and then you can see how things are really, really bright, very grainy too, by the way. So I'm going to take the exposure and start to bring that down a little bit here. Maybe I'll give a little bit of color to it. So we'll kind of copy Caleb's work, and I'll choose a color temperature of like 10,000. And now things are starting to cook. You know, I mean, like it's starting to feel good. It takes a little longer to render all these fine details. You can see those little speckles are taking forever to render. But again, that's the interactive mode here. So I'm going to go ahead and try to frame up my shot here as best as I can, like this. Here we go. Get that ground. I don't mind having the shadows in the shot. It's a nice way of kind of looking. And let me make sure I see the full frame here of what I'm rendering. And I'm going to try to find a nice, pretty spot. So what I like to do is I'll hit View, Select Camera, and I don't have this animation auto keyframe toggle on. I don't want that on at all. So I'll hit View, Select Camera, and I'm going to go ahead and hit S for frame 1. And with that S set, I can kind of just, you know, frame up my shot as best I can. And I'll just hit S again. So that way, if I move around just for testing purposes, I can always just drag my animation here and it'll pop back to that view. You can also do what's called bookmarks. But I like this. And you can see this is beautiful. This is a nice presentation of model that would be good to show to not necessarily an employer, because it's obvious it's not finished yet, but this allows you to just demonstrate something that would be a nice presentation for proof of concept, or you're showing your boss the modeling techniques. As you can see, as we start to get into lighting, we're getting a normals issue right here. This normal needs to probably even be smoothed or something. You'll start to see artifacts, like things are a bit faceted over here. This is a bit faceted and so forth, but in general, it's looking very nice. So as you can see, it just renders out beautifully. It's got a nice fall off back here. You can add another little pool of light if you wish. Creating shadows is a lot of fun. So I'm going to go ahead and take that, and I'm going to go to frame 2. I'm going to find another interesting angle here. So I'm going to try to come around here. Now, remember I was talking about focal length, right? You can come over here and choose select camera. And I'll go to frame 1 again. And you can actually do I'll right click the focal length, set key, and we could do a focal length that's different. So I'll leave this at 303, which is a pretty insane focal length. But for frame 2, I'll go to frame 2, I'll right click here and say set key. I'm gonna put this to something like, let's go to like 35. Obviously we back up pretty far here, but I have set a key, as you can see right here. Right click set key, so if I go to frame 1, it's 300. If I go to frame 2, it's 35. Now, I've set a key for the focal length, now I have to set a key for the camera. So I'm going to hit view select camera, I'm going to zoom in, and try to find something that looks pretty nice. Now, this is one of those cinematic-y, wide-angle-y, fun shots here. You can see it looks really dramatic. I might have to scale up my backdrop because wide angle shots are very wide angle. This gives a nice dynamic three-dimensionality to this for show-off purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and get an angle that's like right there. I still want to see that 2-to-1 ratio. You can see I'm cutting off this edge here, so I'm going to grab my backdrop and scale it up a little bit. Just make it really crazy big so I don't get like some nasty... It's very unprofessional to have any weird edge right here. And then, of course, I can, in this shot, I can also animate the light if I want to move it to the center here. I think this is the area. Let me go ahead and call this my backdrop light. And again, I can move it over here if I wish. You know, put it over here. Gives it a nice feel. Okay, so I'm going to do view select camera and hit S. So for your homework, I would like you guys to have these two setups here. So you have this and you have this. And you guys are going to hand in on Monday these two images. So I want to talk about just rendering. We are IPR rendering right now. That's like a preview render. Okay, so I'm going to go into my render globals and I want to show you. Let's come in here, render globals. If you go to Arnold render here, it has all these setups, and then there is this thing called system. System is actually the interactive renderer. The real render is here. So it's taking these values and it's downgrading it with this right here, initial sampling level, -3. So it's like -3 or 3 times degradation for the sake of speed. Okay, what you'll render here. You can see it takes a little time, but it actually renders a very clean image. And a lot of the noise can be mistaken as film grain or granularity that you commonly see in film or even in digital. So what you can do, if you want to render the real settings, which on default, diffuse spec, transmission, they're all in here. We can actually render with these and not this downgraded version. And that's where you actually render a physical frame. Okay, so we're going to do that. Before we do that, though, I want to just do a little bit of tweaking here on the light. So I'm going to go to my key light, and I want to have this burned out a little bit. I want to get that punch. So I'm going to take my exposure and bring that up a little bit. There we go. So I get that nice punch. Not too much. I don't want to have this pure white. If you want to, you can put your cursor in the temple, the exposure button here, so you can see it's like flickering. And if you hold down Control and left mouse button, keep your cursor here within the box, and you click left mouse button. So here we are. You click in here, it's blinking. Hold down Control, left mouse button, hold, and drag left and right. You get some fine tuning of decreasing and increasing. So this bar is like too dramatic and changes. So doing that, you get some fine detail. So you get the blown out area, but you get a nice fall off here. And now we have some punch. Okay. So what you can do, and we'll render in class, so you don't have to do this and hand it in or anything, is we'll actually render out the images. So I'm not going to use IPR because it's still a low res render of it. You can see it's rendering, but it's got a granularity here. I'm going to close this and save this, by the way. And what I'm going to do is come over here to Arnold, and instead of Arnold render view, we're going to actually render the frame. This is going to take a lot longer to render. Now, it's set to progressive right now. What does that mean? Well, if you go into your render globals while this is rendering, and you come over here to this, you'll see progressive refinement. I believe there's also, let me see if I can find the options here. If you turn off progressive refinement, well, let's just leave it. It doesn't matter. Basically, one renders with little boxes that render, and this one you just have to wait until, obviously, it'll say stop. This will actually come to an end and go done. So it's using these samples 4, 3, 3, 2, 2, 2, and we're going to get into this next class on sample quality, because you don't want granularity. You don't want little frizzy little fireflies, as they're commonly called. Fireflies build up in contrast to areas where there's heavy burned out highlights. That's something you got to watch. Also in dark kind of shadows that are, like these areas here. So you can see this is not a perfect render, but it's pretty good. So you can do save image. Okay. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and save it on my desktop, and I'll call it shot 1. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so it's looking very nice. If I zoom up here, start to see little artifacts here and there. This is not HD yet, right? We're going to eventually render that for someone's reel. We got that nice edge light. We can see this nasty granularity back here. And as far as fireflies are concerned, I don't see any heavy fireflies here in the highlights. But these are what are called fireflies, that kind of stuff. So with that said, let's go ahead and render our other image. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to camera 2 here. And now it's rendering again. And just let it kind of render through. In fact, am I still on? This should be regular render though. Yeah, okay. So this is a full render, and now look at this nice presentation. Now, you could show this for your reel and say to a employer, like, this is a work in progress. And that's being a professional, because a professional will admit to stuff that's not finished or currently in production. And that is admirable, as opposed to, here's a finished product, and it's just like, they'll look at you like, duh. Remember, you're the employer is looking in your eyes, and he wants to know, can I trust this person if I give him a task and go and put him to work? He doesn't come back to me like a helpless baby in a crib, screaming out with its hand sticking out of the crib going, help me. It's okay to get help from an employer, but you should sort of take ownership and be able to take on something and at least have something to present, or get to a point where you didn't have anybody holding your hand. So there's a beautiful render. I'll go ahead and do save image. And then I'll save it again. Image 2. Take a look at that. Okay, so that's looking really nice. This is really something that I wouldn't want to do. We're going to show you how to build a cyclorama, which is basically a beveled kind of object that kind of comes up, so you don't get this nasty artifact. But still, this is a nice presentation of a work in progress for, you're working in a studio, like, boss, what do you think? I just made this. Oh, that's awesome. I can't wait to see it textured. Wow. Oh, wow. You know what? You might want to make this leg less spindly. And that's your art direction, from your boss telling you, yep, here. This is very hard to judge from modeling perspective in the first place, because the perspective is off. This leg is humongous, and this body looks smaller. And that's because of the wide angle lens. So that's why, like I talked about before, how if you are going to judge things for the sake of modeling, you want to be working at 50 millimeter or higher. So that's pretty much it. That's your homework. These 2 images that you can bring in, they're rough. We are going to make some alterations. That's just barely scratching the surface, gang. We have many, many lights. We haven't even got into the materials yet. We're using the Lambert material, but this gives you a nice presentation to give you an idea. So when you present your models or your animations or your composites, this is a beautiful kind of just primer for you to understand lighting. And again, we're going to get into more character work and so forth to really get a feel for how to, we haven't even got into shadow yet. So shadow's a biggie as far as sculpting shadows and creating foreground objects that kind of break up this ground and make it look awesome. It's really great to take something so simple and really make it look complex, even though it's not. And that is the art of minimalism. It's the success of Apple. You know, they have very minimalistic, you know, presentation, but just absolutely beautiful imagery. So anyway, I will see you guys on Monday, and if you have any questions, just email me.